All right, so I am delighted to announce our speaker today, which is Matt Park from Virginia Tech, and Matt will share his preliminary result of his investigation about Chinese speakers in the math grad community. So, go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, so let's shoot. Um, Anna, can you make sure that I'm able to share my screen? Yeah, Anna, you need to make it able so that okay. Share. Okay, so thank you to everyone for coming today. So this is based on work that I did last semester, and I'm trying to expand it into this semester. Um, sort of across departments. And so hear, I'd like to collect feedback and just reactions from all of you guys. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly discuss some of the prior literature and then briefly go into the methods, and then I'm going to talk about two themes that I found from my data collection, and then some of the limitations that I have kind of by virtue of my position, both as a researcher and someone in this particular department. Okay, so I am primarily interested in the factors that Chinese students and professors consider when they decide on a language that they use in their professional work. And this came because I've noticed that just kind of in my everyday life, in my department, sometimes I'll see two people who both speak Chinese, who are from China, speaking to each other in English, but also in Chinese. And I was just curious as to, okay, well, I'm not bilingual. I don't really know how they make these choices. And I'm also curious to see um, if this use of language is also present in their professional work, either in their research or their teaching. So that is my broad research question. Maybe more colloquially, we'll ask Chinese math professors and graduate students, what do they say? Do they say things? How do they say things? Let's find out. Okay, so Um, let me talk a bit about why I'm choosing Chinese scholars as kind of my subject of interest, and particularly in math departments. And when we look at the numbers, we see that mathematics has by far the largest international students make up the largest percentage of students in math departments. Um, And among the graduate students, most of them are Chinese. And this also extends to faculty. Among non-American born faculty members, the most predominant ones seem to be Asian from the data that's out there. Okay. And with these two facts combined, um, I'm hypothesizing that there is a relatively high likelihood that among professor-student pairs that share a non-American cultural background, that's likeliest to be a Chinese one. Okay. So one, it's a matter of convenience, right? If we're going to look at professor-student pairs that might work in a language other than English, then Chinese is a rather likely language for that second language to be. And moreover, the relationship that Chinese students and mathematicians have with the English language is necessarily going to be pretty different from what Europeans um, might have, right? And so from the kind of literature that's out there, there's reason to believe that their relationship will be one that isn't one that I might reasonably be able to like hypothesize from the word go. Okay. And so this whole thing is situated within a field of study called sociolinguistics, and it's a branch of linguistics that attends to the sociological factors of language use. And a key part of this is attending to larger socio-political factors, right? And so, especially in an age of globalization, when English is kind of the lingua franca of STEM, then English isn't going to have a presence in kind of higher STEM education. And we can see this in our own department with the TOEFL exam, right? We expect students to come here with a baseline level of English. However, in recent years, there has been some kind of anxiety that the TOEFL does not really capture um, candidates' true English ability. And some Asian researchers tie this to the kind of high stakes testing culture of their larger culture, right? And I think we are all kind of familiar of the stereotype of testing in Asian countries, and people from over there are worried that it's not it's causing the disconnect between graduate students' English ability and their ability to pass the TOEFL. Furthermore, English is growing as a medium of instruction in China, but it's still relatively rare, right? And some of the research that's also out there on Chinese international students suggests that their English ability, or rather lack of it, is kind of affecting their like quality of life in terms of, well, how can they navigate wider American society? How can they progress professionally? Right. And something in engineering departments is that when there are a kind of critical mass of Chinese international students, they might just tend to stay in their own cohort in a kind of expat bubble, if you will. And so they have limited opportunities to use English in their daily life, right? But this is in an engineering department where the obligations of work might be very different. Specifically in math departments, um, there is an obligation to teach, right? And that expands their opportunities to use English rather than a program which is just research based, for example. So, to look for answers to this question, I did three semi-structured interviews with four participants, and the reason it's three interviews and not four is because one of the interviews was with a professor-student pair. I interviewed a professor and student at the same time, partly because I wanted to give them the opportunity to compare their own experiences and maybe get a sense of what the generational differences might be. Okay, so four participants in total, three professors and one graduate student. Um, and based on just some of their backgrounds, a key difference just demographically is that the professors all did their undergraduate education in China. Whereas the graduate student, she came to the US for her undergraduate degree, and we'll see how those how that kind of demographic difference also manifested in a linguistic difference. And once I did these interviews, I did a basic thematic analysis, and I noticed two themes. One of these themes I'm calling Chinese speech, English text. The second theme I'm calling the needs of others. Okay. So like I said, all the professors had Mandarin as their medium of instruction in their undergrad. And I want to emphasize that this is pretty important, especially in this kind of age of globalization, where in Europe and Latin America, you have a higher frequency of English language math courses. And so this was kind of surprising to me based on just kind of my prior conversations with other international students here. And in the interview, something that was particularly surprising to me was that one of the professors, um, her entire undergrad was conducted in Chinese, and this included relatively high level math courses such as functional analysis. Okay. But once these professors entered their graduate program, they started engaging with English texts. And part of the reason of this was that the kind of cutting edge mathematics that they were engaging with just did not have time to be translated into Chinese yet. And so even though they were learning mathematics in Chinese and even thinking in Chinese, they were reading English. And what reading means here can mean a bunch of different things. Sometimes they were like taking the words and just taking a word or phrase and switching it to the Chinese characters word by word. Other times they weren't. Okay. But something that I want to draw attention to is that at the graduate level in China, probably all the way back to the 90s, there was this very specific presence of English. Okay. And the reason I'm calling this Chinese speech English text is that English was present in a variety of ways. They would submit homework assignments in English. They would have seminar slides in English. They would write on the board in English, but they would still talk in Chinese. Okay. So they might write down like this first phrase. They might write down like M is a compact manifold, but they would say this thing, right? I don't know, I don't know the tones or anything, so I'm not going to say it. But like if you can imagine, like if I was giving these slides, but I was giving this whole lecture in Chinese, then that's the dynamic that appears to have gone on in their graduate education. Okay. And so one takeaway from this is that the pedagogical practices in China makes working in an American context easier, right? And by that I mean like, well, we're all English speakers. We can imagine what it's like to learn Chinese, right? The linguistic difference is pretty stark, right? Um, whew. But something that surprised me is that there were some mentions that the English used in mathematics was surprisingly easy for a lot of these professors, right? Um, one professor even said, like, well, I don't think I could have done this if I were doing something like economics, right? So even though they were practicing for um, the TOEFL, um, they were still like surprised, even though, yeah, they had been learning English and preparing for English tests. There was something that surprised them about how easier comparatively mathematical English was for them. Okay. Now, the second theme I want to talk about is what I'm calling the needs of others. Okay. And this is referring to how they attend to how these Chinese mathematicians attend to what their collaborators or students might need. Okay. And first and foremost, a common theme was whenever there's a non-Chinese speaker, a group of Chinese speakers will just uh, revert to English, right? But kind of implicit in this is that when there are all Chinese speakers, then they will use Chinese. Okay. Um, but that's for collaboration, right? And when we're talking about graduate students, the dynamic is a bit different. Okay. The professor-student pair, um, Chen and Zhang, they worked primarily in English, right? But when Chen needed I guess, drill or really get a concept through to Zhang, then they would work in Chinese, right? So this is evidence to suggest that for these graduate students, Chinese is still a very robust um, and useful language for mathematics. Okay. Um, and another professor, Peng, she told me about how when she came to the US, she was working on she was running a functional analysis seminar with another graduate student who was also Chinese. Okay. But this graduate student, she was educated in the US and so preferred to um, learn about functional analysis in English. Okay. And Peng used this as an opportunity to practice her own English, right? And Peng described this graduate student as not quite an American-born Chinese, or ABC, but something kind of distinct enough to kind of suggest that another category might be meaningful. Okay. And finally, there are the needs of undergrads. Okay. So all the professors suggested that when they're mentoring Chinese undergrads one-on-one, such as in office hours, then they'll ask that student what language they prefer to be taught in. Okay. The difference is Zhang, the graduate student, who only teaches in English, even to other Chinese students. And so there are a lot of things going on here. Something I want to come back to is that, um, excuse me, the um, use of English in a graduate setting. Okay. Are a few things that are going on here. One of them is this idea that, well, we're in America, so we should be using English. Okay. This is a theme that was brought up in the study on engineering students and with the professor-student pair. One of the reasons that they were working in English, the professor said, well, this has to be published in English anyway. We might as well be thinking in it. Okay. And so back to this kind of theme, or back to the needs of sociolinguistics as having to attend to the wider sociopolitical um, context, right? Their obligation to publish in English is motivating their use of English in their day-to-day life. So finally, the limitations, right? So I only had 4 people to work with. There's not very many Chinese professor-student pairs in my department. Okay. Um, and so there's not much reason to believe that I'm necessarily painting a coherent picture with such a small sample size. In particular, I'm sure that at other departments, many more pairs like this exist, and I'd be interested in collecting data related or that kind of data. And there's also this kind of observer effect going on, right? When I hear that, well, when Chinese people, when Chinese mathematicians know that there's a non-Chinese speaker, then they'll revert to English, then then that suggests that, you know, my presence as a non-Chinese speaker is going to affect their conduct in some way, right? And so for me, a kind of ethnographic study might just kind of be out of the picture. And that's not even getting into the fact that I don't know Chinese, right? So I can't compare the conduct of like Chinese language math conduct with English language math conduct, right? That's just outside the scope of my own abilities, right? Um, but there is also like this data just brings up more questions, right? Like how does the conduct of Chinese mathematicians um, differ from like Chinese professors and grad students in engineering departments or business departments? Okay. And what other um, kind of academic fields would be conducive to a study like this? Okay. And I also don't think that we have to just look at the sociolinguistics of of Chinese students. Um, right? It's just kind of obvious to me as an Asian American that this is a prominent demographic, right? Like I that there might be like certain um there might be other demographics in other like cultural uh traditions that I'm just not aware of, right? Like for like any of my for any like white person in the audience, like right, like your um your outlook on European immigration might inform you as to like, well, who's coming over here, who is like represented, right? And there's just a lot of different ways this can go, right? I think like, yeah, anyway, I'll just leave you to kind of think about like, well, who else is uh whose immigration experience can like would be viable to look at from like a numbers perspective. But that's just me kind of rambling this point. Thank you everyone for coming today and listening to me ramble. Um, this is very much a work in progress, and I am looking to expand this to some other departments with some other collaborators who I'm already talking to. And so at this point, I'd really appreciate questions, concerns, feedback, anything like that. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Um, I would like to open the floor. I also have a lot to say because my research coincided with Matt's a lot, and I can share a lot of what I found through interviewing eight people. But I would like to invite anybody else to speak first.
Hi, Matt. Great
Hey,
talk.
Johan, what's up?
Um, are you aware of Jocelyn Gonzalez Rios?
Jocelyn Rios?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's because that's when you start presenting. I went to JMM and I heard her speak about lessons from multicultural bilingual students. And I know hers is like undergrad level and yours is graduate students and professors.
hmm
But I think that might be a conversation to strike up with her to see if she has any guidance. Because I
hmm
know she recently defended
Yeah,
like two
like a
years ago.
year ago or
Yeah.
something.
So I think she'll probably have a lot more guidance in helping you with the limitations and making sure that you can talk through it and just rationalize it for yourself and also for the committee to hear about. But yeah, no question. I just wanted to like name drop her.
Okay, great, thanks.
Hey Matt, good to see you.
Hey,
Thanks
good
for
to
the
see you.
thanks for the presentation. I had two questions. First one, I was wondering how you got these participants in your sample, and then I was also wondering what kind of questions you were asking, because you were talking about they mentioned thinking and what language they were thinking in. So I was wondering what kind of questions you asked to get to
Yeah,
like
so the the interview was there were like kind of stages to the interview. The first was about their kind of educational background. So I wanted to kind of get some context as to where they went to school, what their school was like, how they were exposed to English in their school, right? Um, and then and then we transitioned into how they work in the US. And these are all very kind of direct questions. So there was like an instance of like, okay, well, where I believe I asked, well, okay, so like, do you still think in this language? That came up once, but another time, I believe a participant just said, I'm always like, it's hard because I have to translate my thoughts from Chinese to English when she was talking about the um, mathematical communication.
cool, thanks.
And because these are all people kind of in my department, then a lot of the um uh, the recruitment was just kind of direct email. And so they're people that I've I've like taken a class with or like a classmate, and that's how I got the student professor pair, is that the professor is his student is one of my colleagues. So there was a uh, prior relationship there.
Thank you.
So I would have had a great suggestion for another school you could study if somebody didn't close the entire graduate department. But West Virginia University had a very interesting relationship with international students, where we had very preeminent Chinese American researchers who would literally go back to China to recruit graduate students, get them directly into the program, and then hold lectures in Chinese.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
very direct.
yeah, it's almost like we had a sub graduate program which was just this person's students, and it was like an entire research group. There was like postdocs under it, more than one individual faculty, and you just walk by the classroom. This is just a graduate course, and it's being held in Chinese for these students. I think it's more of a seminar than anything, but it was a very distinctive thing that created a lot of interesting phenomenon in the department of the differences between the international students and the American students, where they came in with very different qualifications. Whereas for the labor part of it, it was so much easier for the department if they hired American students because they can just throw them in a classroom and who cares. And then they really struggled and put a lot of the thought and effort into getting these Chinese students to pass their TOEFL exams, and figuring out ways of funding them when they have not passed their TOEFL exam was another big feature of the administration of the department. I know because one of my mentors, Dr. Jessica Deschler, was the graduate director and is currently the chair of the department. And I've heard lots of like, okay, how do we get this to work from her? So it was a very interesting environment. I don't know what is left of it at this point because, again, the president of the university decided that mathematics is a field that really doesn't need to exist in their engineering school. They are very smart, as you can tell. So I don't know what is left of that phenomenon. I don't know if I know they're continuing out the graduate students and letting them graduate, I know because I'm working with one of the room students who's still there trying to graduate. I don't know what is left of that. But there has to be other places doing similar phenomenon, and that would be probably a very interesting case study if you can find them. If there's a very big difference between international students in departments that just happen to have Chinese faculty and places where Chinese faculty are intentionally recruiting international students.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really interesting. I had no idea that people would be so kind of direct with recruitment like that. Um, but that does raise like an interesting question of like, well, how does that set them on like a trajectory for their career? How do they view their time in the US? Is it just like a temporary thing? A lot of questions.
Okay, I want to share the feedback. Actually, what Tim said just prompted an idea. I think it's a completely different avenue. But one of the professors that I'm teaching a course with, apparently he has both graduate students at OU, at our university, and I guess in France as well. So I don't know if that's something that would be of interest of you. I guess it's a popular practice to be like a guest professor or guest advisor at different university overseas as well. But I think I had so much to say. I think it's difficult to so from my study, I tried to recruit graduate students who got their undergraduate degrees in different countries and were taught primarily not in English. So then when they come to the US, I was really curious about this English transition to English or having taught graduate math in English. And a lot of the times what I've seen, I've had only one person from China, and he has a master's in math that he got in Taiwan, and then a master's in physics that he got in China. And what I've experienced from everybody else, him including, that once you get beyond like calculus sequences, um, topology, and then your abstract algebra, real analysis, anything beyond that is taught in English for resource scarcity, like you mentioned as well, that people just don't translate math fast enough into anything that's not English. And if it happens, then those courses are taught in their native language. I also think that there is this huge stigma that you mentioned. Most of the scholars are expected to know how to do and produce and read math and English because it is predominant language in our field. Um, and when students come here, what I've noticed or witnessed through the interviews is that what they've learned, they started learning new information in English. So for example, the compact, I actually smiled because I think the participant who was from China said that the compact is somehow more intuitive to say in their language than in English because it gives more meaning or more linguistic background to what it actually means to be a compact set, for example. But what they learn, if pretend that you stop learning math in, for example, Russian after calculus 4, and then everything else beyond that was in English, and you accumulate English vocabulary of higher mathematics that you just don't know the translation to your native language to. And it's hard to communicate with your advisor, even if you guys speak the same language, but all of a sudden you speak about high mathematical terms. And you just don't know the translation of that. And I don't know how productive that would be. What I've also noticed is that some students communicate in their native language. I had two Spanish speaking participants, and they defaulted to speaking Spanish amongst themselves when it was sort of like brainstorming and personal, like kind of ease off the situation choice. And everybody stuck to at least writing in English. Nobody really defaulted to their native language. So, I also think that it would be really cool and niche idea to stick to Chinese speaking graduate students, especially if the research supports that there is a lot of them. Um, I don't know how the recruitment of that would go beyond your department.
Great, thanks. No, it's all interesting stuff, right? And there's just so much to say about, what attitudes toward English people like these students are bringing. Um, and uh, I'm not gonna go down that rabbit hole myself, but I mean, maybe I'll go down it a little bit where it's just like another thing I'm trying to be I was wondering was like, is English a sign of education, right? Um, among these graduate students, right? Because in some ways, like they come to the US and they are these kind of minoritized individuals, right? But back home, like um their like social standing could be very different, right? And when we talk about their attitude toward English, how does how do all of these attitudes fit together, right? And what does that kind of mean for how we address it?
Can I just share what I've
Yeah.
heard from my participants? I think there was a mixture. I think one person came from um, I forget. It was an Asian country, but he was really struggling with TOEFL. And when he came here, he said that he just stopped thinking in his native language altogether because he wanted to improve his English to the standards that he deemed high enough. There was the Chinese participant that told me that he never strived to be good in English. He always thought of English as a tool, not as a indicator of success. And a lot of them, most of the participants also said that they stopped using the resources in their native language, thinking about math in their native language because it doesn't make sense anymore. They're in a in the grad program, that's taught solely in English. The resources, anything they want, they'll always find it in English. There's not really, it's almost a waste of time, they think of it, to look in their native language. Um, so yeah, I guess that those are the two main things that I've noticed.
That makes sense. And that's, I think, what a lot of people have heard, like just kind of in passing. But it's nice to kind of have it would be nice to have like research to back this up. So yeah, I mean, I think we can just go to basically uh there are people in basically all of our departments that we could just go to and ask these questions. Um, but like until it's published, it's not real or something. Knowledge doesn't exist till it's like inaccessible through a journal. But that's just the paradox of academia, and
And if the people who want should be listening don't want to hear it, it doesn't matter even if it is published.
I love the optimism.
Matt, I had a question. Well, first of all, thanks for sharing your work in progress. It's always exciting to hear what's going on and how things are shaping up. Um, my question hits on it's been developing as I've been hearing the questions that people have been asking, the feedback that people have been asking. Um, let me see if I can encapsulate this briefly. I think the one thing that I'm wondering is I have a bunch of possible questions that I was writing down while you were going through your actual talk, but I don't know how many of them are actually relevant to what you're interested in. I think my question is specifically so your research question was what factors influence or impact whether um, folks are using Chinese or English language in these professional or graduate school contexts. I'm curious specifically what your goal is in studying these. Are you interested specifically in like impact on students, what it's like to navigate the experience of going through grad school, thinking through and learning mathematics? Are you interested in, I know you had the professor student pair. Are you interested on the mentoring experience, how mentors and mentees ought to be paired who are in this situation where they speak English as a second language and
Mm-hmm.
have that Chinese background? Are you interested in more like socio-political implications for the field, given the fact that we do recruit a lot of people from Chinese speaking nations, and that is like a political piece to consider?
Mm-hmm.
Before I ask anything else, I'm just curious, what are you most interested in out of these things? I mean, it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be any one thing, but for this study, or what has driven you to this study, what are you gravitating toward as
So that
what are you most interested in thinking about in relation to this?
so that's a good question. Personally, um, just the question of how do we understand mathematics as a cultural practice, right? And there's a lot kind of out there about, there's a lot of hypothesizing out there about like how the language you speak influences the way that you talk and so on. And a lot of these theories are debated by people that only speak one language, which always kind of amuses me. But um, as an Asian American, you kind of grow up with this awareness of the Eastern Hemisphere, right, and how things are done over there, right? Um, and when you look at kind of the history of mathematics, then you see like Japanese people do well in geometry, Chinese people do well in differential equations, um, Indians and their the way their relationship with computing and so on, right? Um, and I don't, this is a kind of delicate conversation to have, isn't it? Right. But kind of with all that said, I think that like the language is one of the kind of the easier entry points into this kind of cultural investigation, right? It's a very simple question to ask, um, and to kind of analyze data about, right? And I do think that it does sound like kind of orientalizing to say like, well, there's a specific Chinese way of thinking, right? But I do think that we can like ask, well, what are kind of the features, what are the kind of attitudes of this kind of pedagogy that we can learn from, right? And it, yeah, that's kind of my most basic answer right there.
That does help a lot. Lots there. I mean, that could sustain you for a while thinking
Yeah.
about big questions like those. And I definitely understand the tension of assuming any kind of like statements about it's different in this culture or it's the same across all cultures. This makes me think about a few buzzwords. I'm by no means an expert in this, but it makes me think about ethnomathematics research that's been done in our field, and specifically conversations about continental mathematics, and also like how much of the practices of the field of math that gets published are like Western perspectives on mathematics. Are there other things? But specifically, I guess thinking more actionable in this study in the moment of what you're thinking about, I'm wondering back to the larger theory that you were mentioning in the beginning, sociolinguistics. And I'm also thinking about the binary, or at least implicit binary, that you created multiple times between thinking in Chinese and doing in Chinese or like speaking in Chinese or writing in Chinese, it made me think about what specific theoretical framework within sociolinguistics you're appealing to conceptualize, especially when you were talking about what you just did around interest in like the practice of doing mathematics given the language that you grew up with and how are things different. It makes me think about how is thinking contextualized or conceptualized within the theoretical frame that you're thinking from. It makes me think of, again, not an expert, but I've been around people who are experts. I've heard the term multi-languaging when I've been to studies about this before. It makes me think about practices that people do in relation to their language while doing math or navigating a space, and how that might, digging into one of those specific frameworks, and I guess I'm curious if you have started thinking in relation to one of those frameworks. I guess you didn't necessarily share exactly how your analysis went and some of the details of that. So maybe you have started to think about that. But I'm curious how you're conceptualizing thinking and speaking and separating them versus not separating them. I wonder if that might be a fruitful way of going forward
Yeah.
in some of these.
Yeah, Brady. That's part of why this is like I'm calling this a preliminary study because I don't
Yeah.
necessarily have that. I have like picked up some books on it though, so that's gonna be my direction, my theoretical direction, or my direction for the theory
Yeah.
going
Ended in a
forward.
question. Have you thought, and it's okay if the answer is no, have you thought about a framework within sociolinguistics or one that you are gravitating toward that seems appealing to you, right?
I'm looking for one, but I'm in the search process.
So fair.
Um, but yeah, like I also kind of want to mention like this kind of practice of the Chinese international students. It's not one that's totally foreign to us, right? Because um, even today you have a lot of people who are working in things like algebraic geometry who go to papers that were written in French, right? And so that kind of practice of translating um, to a language was still pretty active over here until maybe recently. Maybe it's still ongoing, right? But this isn't something that's kind of, I don't want to necessarily give the impression that this is a kind of unique relationship that us as English speakers don't have access to, right? Like if we wanted to look for things that originated in France or Germany, right? Historically very strong countries, right? Then we could do that, right? Um, and until very recently, it was pretty standard to have like a bilingual requirement to get a math PhD, right? Lucky us that that's not there anymore, but it also kind of isolates us from the rest of the world in a way.
Yeah, I was about to jump in as the old person here. I remember back when I was looking at graduate programs, some of the ones that I was looking at had a foreign language requirement. So I'm like, that's recent memory. It's not that old.
Yeah, Matt, if you're looking for resources just like of researchers that have compared US education, math education to Chinese math education, Leaping Ma is one that sticks out to me. Um, it's just if that helps you at all.
Hmm. Gotcha. Thanks.
And then Brady, I was wondering when you said multi-languaging, is that the same thing as translanguaging when you're kind of like blending multiple languages together um, in your speech or written work or whatever?
I have heard those words used in relation to each other. I don't know if I can answer the question as somebody who's by no means an expert, though. That is another good buzzword to add, though, that might point you in a direction, Matt. I will just say
Multi
a direction with no adjective because I don't know what that direction is. But
Right, because I did hear a lot like translate languaging when you were saying that they would speak in Chinese but then write in English. That's using multiple resources, multiple language tools, communicate ideas. I have no like foundational texts about translanguaging, but yeah, that's a big buzzword.
Gotcha.
Yeah, on that point too, as you were talking and you gave a few examples, I was wondering if so you the way you presented it was kind of one theme where a Chinese speech English text. I'd be curious if you have looked into some of the specific examples. I don't know what your specific interview questions were, so maybe it didn't give as many specific examples that they gave. But I'd be curious if you saw different examples for how people were navigating that and unpacking some of those and sharing some of those. So for people who, like, I primarily think and speak in English, so that's not something that I've had to experience. I wonder if unpacking those might help you notice some of the things that you're interested in digging into, or if maybe you have started doing this. I think that might be something to consider the next time you share this data, if that's something that um, the responses were detailed enough to be able to dig into.
Gotcha.
Something that came to my mind as I was talking about that one example from West Virginia University, I have confirmed that faculty has retired recently. Um, what does the graduate school application and admissions process look like for international Chinese students? What do they think they're getting themselves into? What are they promised as they are admitted into these programs that are everything is in a language foreign to them? And that's something that is not addressed with my research in any way, shape, or form. I started my entire process with a very clear focus on domestic students, just for my own personal sanity of I can't handle too much large of a scope at once. But that does leave a lot of possibility space. I don't think there has been a lot of research on what does the graduate school admissions process look like for Chinese students. And they are a significant portion of our graduate students. This isn't like a very small demographic that we're talking about. It's probably like 30% of all graduate students in the US are from mainland China. Like it is a very significant number when you go over the um, AMS used to publish it. They haven't done it recently, data on the profession, and you can go through and look up not too much specificity, but enough to see the broad picture. So definitely there is a large number of Chinese graduate students who are being recruited to America to go into these graduate programs, and there is no literature on what any of that looks like.
Okay, so a big gap in the graduate student research. Very fruitful one.
Graduate education research doesn't really have gaps. It has tiny little filled in spots.
Yeah, really. More generally, though, it does make me wonder if there's any higher ed literature on international grad students more generally that tapping into would help you think through with this math. I know the math context is a specific context where there isn't as much, but I know there has been a lot in the specifically sociopolitics of international graduate students, given that that is where a lot of funding sources and things come from. So specifically because you're thinking of the socio-linguistic angle, that might be fruitful if you find at least a few cutting edge studies there. It might put you in directions that could help contextualize things to justify why this matters beyond math as well.
Gotcha. Thanks. So any final thoughts, questions, comments?
All right, I'm gonna stop the recording, if that's okay.